Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I have a very special guest. This is retired Air Force Colonel Sam Gardiner. How are you doing today, Sam?
Good.
Excellent. I'm super excited to have you on because the reason I want to talk to you is because you've had a long history in doing war games in a professional context. So, for people who are getting to know you, how did you get into professional wargaming in your career? Is that something that happened early, or did you stumble on it later?
No, I taught strategy at the National War College for about 10 years. And early into that, I discovered that war games were a best way to almost understand strategy. So my class, each class would be a mini war game, and the students would be asked to play roles, and then we would examine afterwards what came out of that discussion.
Is wargaming something that you discovered as a hobby first?
Nope, no, it's just like going in and say, uh, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, what do we do? That's a war game. To the extent that you examine future alternatives and the strategic dynamics that are involved in that situation. So it's actually what it is. It's an extension of adult learning. You know, adults don't learn when they're told things. Adult learns when they explore things. So that was it, sort of where my thinking came from and why it pushed me in that direction.
You know, when you say that, I'm not sure that children learn things from being told either. So I feel like
Oh,
that works for me.
certainly adults don't.
When you came across the thought of doing this in your classroom, is it something that other people were already doing, or did you just instinctively figure it out trying to get your students to engage?
I think I moved in my own direction. Uh, in fact, it worked, and the students were excited about it, and so that's it.
That's awesome. I like having this conversation because I feel like this is an indicator that really anybody can wargame and wargaming can spring up anywhere. You know, we have very complex rule sets on some of them and stuff now, but it could also just start with a good question. So how structured were your war games while you were in the classroom? Sometimes it sounds like you started with just a question, but how complicated could they get?
But before you do a war game, I think you have to understand is what the strategic dynamics of the situation are. You don't just go off and do. The Navy has had war games up at Newport, Rhode Island, for uh, 50 years, and they are very detailed. And they just sort of said, "Well, let's have a war game and see what happens." That's not the way I conducted it. I, if the strategic dynamic is that if Iran has a nuclear weapon, that's going to change relations in the Middle East. How does it change, and what does that mean? So you're pushing a storyline that has to do with strategic situation and the dynamics. And in any strategic situation, I guess there are probably three or four dynamics you need to understand. And so that was once you sort of narrow in on those, you push to examine what the consequences are.
How do you pick the most important things that you want to home in on in these games? Because I mean, these situations are really complicated. So what level of of closeness to the subject and focus can you get in these scenarios?
Well, that one maybe Ukraine is a good example. There are we're at a sort of a focal point of what the future is going to look like. And there are a number of things it could do. It could be the Donald Trump solution, or Russia may not go along with that. So just those are two alternative futures you need to understand, and then talk about what the consequences of either of those are.
Nice. All right. So we've kind of launched you as somebody who uses war games in in classroom contexts, but it's also really clear from some of the notes that you sent me before this interview that you took your wargaming and you applied it to um, situations outside of the classroom. So briefing ambassadors and working with organizations. Is that something that started after you'd begun teaching, or did you bring something that you'd done professionally into your classroom?
No, it sort of came after I did teaching, and then I sort of had a reputation for doing war games, and people would call me and ask me to get involved.
Excellent. So, what are some of your favorite projects that you have worked on in that context?
Oh, well, probably the one that I think was most significant was the Iran nuclear issue. In over a period of 3 or 4 years, I may have done 10 or 15 or 20 different war games examining that consequence, or that situation and the consequence of it. The thing about, because I didn't work for anybody, I could test different audiences. With the Iran situation, uh, I did and described a game for the Atlantic. It was actually described in the magazine one month. I did a game for the CNN, in which with the actual players examining what alternatives were. By the time I had finished that couple of years, I had some conclusions. I wrote some papers as a result of those conclusions. Uh, I was invited by the U.S. ambassador to the UN to come to an informal meeting of the Security Council, in which I briefed what the results of the games had shown. And as part of that, I sat next to the ambassador from Iran and looked him in the eye and said that if you respond in a wrong way, uh, you will be forced with regime change. The consequence of this getting out of hand, you need to understand. So it gave me an opportunity to talk about policy in ways that you couldn't do otherwise.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, when you told the ambassador this, how did he respond?
Uh, like an ambassador. I mean, they had known the reason the meeting was called was because they knew what I had been doing, and so they were opening to listening, and it was Zakhariev was the ambassador at the time, who speaks very good English, and he's very Western oriented. So he knew what he was seeing and what was involved. So he responded, uh, but I presumably the message got back to Tehran, because you don't have a meeting of the Security Council for the purposes of talking about your country and not report back home.
I mean, fair enough. So, when you ran these games for, like, say, CNN, how how did you structure the game differently for like different audiences? So, if you're playing it with students, you might do it one way, but how does it change for like a magazine or a news organization?
Well, the game I did for CNN was actually with principals. Uh, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, was one of the players. And when you do something like that with those kinds of players, you need to be relatively sophisticated. And that one of the things that came out of that game was we got people who truly had a grasp of how much destruction would occur if we attacked the Iranian nuclear facilities and then how long it would take for them to repair those facilities. And after we did that, uh, one of the players said, uh, we may have to live with Iran with nuclear weapons. And, you don't blow up the knowledge to produce a weapon. So no matter how many times we blow that up, they have the knowledge to produce a nuclear weapon. Iran is a virtual nuclear power, just as Sweden is a virtual nuclear power.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, that's it. So, it sounds like your gaming about Iran was, I guess, relatively successful in that you got to do a lot of research. People listened to what you had to say. How do you make sure that people are going to listen in war games? And also, how do you, what happens if you miss a perspective?
Well, but by doing it more than once, you, you tend to search for perspective. The, whether people miss, one of the other things is I wrote a paper for the Century Foundation in which I summarized all of it. So it wasn't as if it were done and just laid out for others to look at. I wanted to tell people what I thought we were saying. And frankly, that's been during the Bush administration, and we've lost it. The knowledge didn't hang around because we just read this last week that Biden asked what would happen if we attacked the Iranian nuclear facility.
Oh, so the things that you learned from that war game didn't necessarily get passed down to future administrations.
Yeah, yeah,
All right. So this also leads me to ask, I asked about missing perspectives because um we also kind of came to this prepared maybe to talk about your game about policy in Libya and what happens if not everybody um is heard. So
yeah.
could you tell us about the interagency game that you did for the DoD?
Yeah, not too well because I don't remember it very well. It wasn't that profound. But there are, no, let me use a different example. Let me
Sure.
use Ukraine. I've been working on a game on Ukraine, and what becomes clear to me is that one of the negative outcomes is it occurs if the United States doesn't continue to provide assistance to the government to fight that war. Could I go to the State Department and say, I want to do a game for you to show what happens if the United States doesn't provide assistance to Ukraine? They can't do that. You can't do that. The administration wouldn't allow the State Department to provide them a policy option. So what has to happen is you have to go outside of the institutions and do enough so that you get people's attention, but you do it where it's possible to really examine an alternative. Uh, you know, if the president found out that the State Department was examining increased military aid to Ukraine, maybe they'd be on today's list for people fired.
Fair. All right. So, how are you going about your work on your game, and who are you hoping is going to play it?
Well, I'm starting this a little bit differently because it's so sensitive. I'm actually doing it on one-on-one with people. Uh, I have some contacts from doing this before, and I ask them to examine the key issues. And so I'm doing this by micro steps. Uh, and I think it probably at the end, I will end up having to write something about what the conclusion is. But then, and the thing of it, uh, Trump is not very wise with respect to understanding second order consequences. He can't do what happens if this happens. He can say, I want this to happen, so that it's even harder to get to him. If you tell him that well, what's coming out of what I've been doing so far is that Russia is very likely to keep fighting and cause a humanitarian crisis. And the humanitarian crisis at a time when Europe is just like the United States. They have turned negative against refugees and displaced persons. So he has a weapon that he can use against all of Europe, not just the Ukraine, which is the chaos of humanitarian disaster.
Ooh. So when you are designing this game, how is the game structured? Like how many people is it for? And what kinds of rules are you putting in place to kind of help people understand the situation as you see it?
Uh, it starts out not very structured. But as I've talked to people, I find out what people don't know and what I have to put into sort of the background of the game. And one of those is this change in Europe about refugees. You know, everybody was so open to Ukrainian in 2020 that people assume that that's the case, but it's not the case. Uh, Politicians in Poland, Germany, France, the UK, etc., are, are developing negative attitudes about we don't want, they're bad people, they do crime. It's almost as if Trump is giving them a script to read from.
Who knows what we'll discover one day. But so you also mentioned that you have been doing a lot of one-on-one play because you are concerned about having a game that's about sensitive issues. Um, at what point do you think a game is too sensitive? Like how gritty are you getting versus it's just a political issue that people have a lot of strong feelings about?
Well, I'm at the stage right now where I've gone one-on-one to, I send out parts of the game to maybe 50 people. And of that 50 people, all of whom are in Ukraine interest group, I'll get back maybe two or three uh, suggesting I shouldn't badmouth Trump, that he's going to find a solution.
I mean, is it bad mouthing to ask questions? I mean, maybe in this world, but
Yeah, no, it is. It's bad mouthing to say that, you know, that Trump will not have a political solution that's going to be acceptable to Ukraine and Russia.
okay, this actually leads me to a fresh question. You talked about your one of your previous games, the game about War with Iran, being one that you conducted during the Bush administration. So that means that you have successfully done policy work under conservative administrations in the past. So how do how have you felt from administration to administration? And do you feel that more than just politics has changed?
Yeah, everybody is sensitive to not saying the country line. Uh, People are afraid to do that, and really, the commandant of the Coast Guard was fired yesterday because she did uh, feeling exercises or discussions about accepting people of different color, of different sexual orientation. I mean, it's not just sensitive in the sense that you shouldn't do it, but you get fired if you do it. The evidence is.
So, was that true under previous administrations where you were doing these games, or do you think people used to be more open to different
People
viewpoints?
used to be more open. That it was possible to have a part of the government that was examining alternatives, and that wasn't in itself a threat, but it appears now to be a threat.
Would you say that that was true under Bush and under, say, like Clinton, or I don't know who you were working under?
It wasn't true under Bush. Uh, Certainly to the extent that it is now.
Interesting. You also have like this long-running interest in humanitarian issues. So you're very concerned about a humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And am I correct in remembering that you've also done a game about Syria?
Yeah, again, not significant. It's not in my top list of things.
I think it's significant just because I mean, Syria is undergoing some changes right now as well. I
Yeah,
guess I just want to know, like, did things play out the way that your game did? And if you're doing a new one, what would that look like?
yeah, and then there's or that is the issue of chemical weapons. Uh, if that were introduced, it would change the situation. Uh,
Interesting. All right, so you mentioned some of your games that you see as like more or less significant than others. So let's talk about another one of your top games. What's a very significant game that you want to talk about?
uh, One of them has to do with nuclear weapons.
Okay.
We haven't done well adapting to the way the world has changed. More people having nuclear weapons. And then a major significant change is that the size of the nuclear weapons now being produced by the United States and Russia are much smaller than what we knew when Nagasaki and Hiroshima were attacked. Nagasaki and Hiroshima, maybe a 40 or 50 kiloton weapon. Russia has a weapon that is zero point 0.5 kiloton. In the olden days, if somebody, one of the powers, United States or Russia, wanted to attack an air base, it would do so with a weapon that was big. Now they have weapons that are small that would do the same damage to the airbase, so that the threshold of disaster has gone down. It's possible we could see an exchange of nuclear weapons that wouldn't be as disastrous as we had thought about it in the past. Also, it now is that conventional weapons can have the same impact. The same damage can be exerted on that airbase with precision guided conventional weapons as would be with the nuclear weapon. So that what happens is this whole notion of the role of nuclear weapons in the future comes unglued at a time when we have not done that. As far as the United States policy is concerned, we're, big shoot. As far as the Europeans are concerned, it's the big shoot. Now it may be possible to say, Russia, if you do this, we're certainly going to bomb you bad with conventional weapons. That changes the whole equation. And it should change that we shouldn't fear nuclear weapons the way we did. And Bob Woodward's book is interesting from one respect. It seemed that the chairman and the president both thought of nuclear weapons only in terms of the large sizes that were used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because they were just terrified that over Korea that we might have some sort of a nuclear exchange. That doesn't need to be the case anymore. We've got to think through this whole post-Cold War, post-World War II role that nuclear weapons play in foreign policy and in military policy.
So if we're going to think that through, what does that game look like? What roles would you give and what options would you give to help people figure that out?
Well, that's what's so interesting is I came to this conclusion in my class at the National War College, and when I had the students play the Russians. At the end of doing that, one of the students said, real men don't need nuclear weapons.
Uh, what does that mean?
That means that we can do whatever we want to do with conventional weapons. And so why have this fearful threshold that's before us that has had such an impact on thinking about foreign relations and military power since the end of World War II?
I mean, do you think it's better that people are really afraid of nuclear weapons, though? Because it does kind of make people back off. If people are less afraid of them, then what?
No, I think that if you're less afraid of them, the reason to use them diminishes.
Mm. Oh, so they're like less of a threat, less of a blackmail.
That's a role in in. I spent a tour at Shape, the the military headquarters for NATO, and at that time, almost any option. No, the only options we considered playing games is if the Russians penetrated the inner German border was for us to use nuclear weapons and larger nuclear weapons. There need to be more options in that. That was a dangerous period. It still is a dangerous period. Uh, we need to be able to think about how to stop a Russian invasion with conventional weapons and not go to the extreme of nuclear weapons.
Interesting. So when you use games to do this, I mean, I feel like the term game is something that we're just casually using.
Yeah,
Have you seen, like, when you tell people, oh, let's play a war game to figure this out, what is the general response to that? And how much respect do people have for games as a way of talking about these issues and working on them?
I, I'd be careful about even using that term in some audiences. We need to think about alternative futures and examine how we would respond to them rather than use the term war game to talk to somebody.
Oh,
Again,
so you
I
never call it a game at all.
no, it depends on the audience. Sometimes it draws and sometimes it repels.
That's fair. So when you first started doing these simulations, let's say in your classroom, did you call them games from the get-go, or was that something that came later?
No, just walk in and say, okay, you're now the Russian general staff. Here's the situation. What would you do?
So at what point did you start referring to what you were doing and designing as games?
I don't know. I think probably more now than at the time. Uh, I went that way of teaching because adults respond to it.
Right.
So I say I'm going to do a game. I'm going to say I'm going to teach a seminar every week in which adults respond to the way the seminar is conducted and seem to learn and are intrigued and want to learn more about the subject.
Right. So this is definitely pedagogy first. It's really interesting to talk to you about this because my first encounters with professional wargaming are through people who have connections to hobby wargaming. So, I've played Valko Rinke's coin games. He was at the CIA. Or, I speak pretty frequently with Sebastian Bay, who is at Georgetown, and he's running all of those war games. So for you, like, how have things developed and changed, I guess, since the start of you discovering that this works pedagogically to now where people pretty much seem to treat it as a normal thing?
Um, let me react. You said uh, pedagogy. Is that what you said?
Pedagogy. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, what I would call it andragogy, which is adult, the Italian or Latin for adult as opposed to child. Uh, the difference is that I think that between yeah I haven't really thought much about this, but I think that the that the professional stuff doesn't grasp the strategic implications the way you need to for adults who are interested in policy. You can grasp that uh, lots of blue chips overwhelm little red chips. But the strategy of what's behind that, and which is very complex, uh, you don't get to in a professional war game.
Interesting. So, just in your own life, do you play games for fun as well, or is gaming something that's for classroom only?
No, I didn't play for fun. No, it's I played for understanding.
I
I,
mean,
I,
that's fair.
I never did games. It's sort of been this evolution.
Got you. So you're never like an Avalon Hill guy or like interesting. So how does it, I mean, did you encounter people who were and did they understand what you were doing and have ideas about it?
Not very much, no. I mean, there seems to be, I would assert that there is a population that does that, and populations that worry about real policy issues are not one and the same. They're two different populations.
Interesting. In my perspective, I do think they've done some more combining, but it's very interesting to like hear about it like this. All right, so another thing I kind of want to talk about is that you've talked a bit about wargaming sensitive issues and about humanitarian issues, but I think you also really see this kind of game as a way to build consensus. So, could you say more about that and give some examples of how you've done that throughout your career?
I did a couple games at different times in Nepal. Nepal is a country that has been dominated by communists for many years. It has had a king, but the king went away and they reverted to dictatorship. And the U.S. embassy in Kathmandu was having troubles internally because they didn't agree how to react. They it started with they knew coming up was going to be the king was going to go and there was going to be an assembly that takes over. And so the question is, what should U.S. policy be in light of this change? And policy towards Nepal is essentially humanitarian aid. Do we bring food? Do we do education? What is it we want to do to support U.S. policy in light of what the government is about? And there was a terrible disagreement going on within the country team about what to do. Uh, and so these two war games we did, by the time we finished, they ended up agreeing that the purpose should be next generational. In other words, okay, people are starving, that's bad, things are going bad. But if US policy is going to have leverage, it is in terms of having a generation after this one that can move in the direction of more democratic institutions. So it was a way of coming to a consensus, and it seems to have worked. I talked to somebody who was more recently in the embassy, and that's still their focus. Their second generational focus of U.S. policy, to the extent that we can do anything. It's still limited, but I did. That comes to mind. One of the first games I did when uh, I retired was I did a strategy game for the Ford Motor Company, and they were asking the question, what happens? What should our future strategy be with respect to the building of auto plants and construction of cars in Asia? There was a big movement after Nixon to move more commercial interest in Asia. And of the game, the conclusion was fairly clear that the players came to saying that if we do this, in a few years, China will take over and will be selling goods to us. So it is a mistake to try to go there and have them build parts factories it's going to backfire, and we will be the subject of that consequence. Uh, and it was culturally so antithetical to the way Ford Motor Company thought. We go where we can buy parts cheapest, that they were unable to come to grips with it. It was almost as if it was a knowledge that they couldn't handle about the future, because it would require them to change about the present, and they were unable to do that. And that's probably true. Talk even about Ukraine and the United States policy now. Uh, you know, we probably need to provide more aid, more military aid to Ukraine. Uh, but that's almost beyond the pale. There's almost nobody who would stand up and say, not, it's not a question of keeping what we provide to Ukraine, keeping that level, but it's a question of increasing the levels. Not many people sign up to that.
Interesting. All right, so I want to circle back around this, but one thing that I've noticed as you talk about war game, and I think it's important because when you think war, you just think conflict, kinetic conflict, especially in the hobby world. But when you talk about a war game, you're talking about aid, you're talking about policies about cars, you're talking about a lot of things that don't necessarily have to do with actual fighting. So to you, like, what is the scope of what a war game could include?
The scope is a situation of conflicting interests and objectives and ways to achieve objectives. So it can be anything. We could war game what's for dinner tomorrow night.
That could turn into a war depending on the options. So I guess this leads me to ask. I mean, it seems like the moment to ask, right? You mentioned in multiple contexts, right, that you're very interested in consensus building. And it seems that the results of your games often lean towards we should aid other countries in the world. So, um, I guess my thought is, what is your hope for what people will hear from this? And then what do you think the consequences of giving all of that aid, of doing all those things, will be for the state of the United States and the world?
Now, I hadn't thought about that, but in part of your question is the notion that we have a role, not just telling people what to do in the world, but helping them understand what ought to be done, uh, which is much better. And adults don't like to be told how to see the world, but if you can help them understand how to see the world, it would be a major step forward in foreign policy.
Yeah. And even within our country, like we're not in a place, I think, where our consensus building as a society is very good. Um, how, as somebody who has done a lot of consensus building, would you say that we could work on that?
Oh yeah, and in fact, that uh, people probably forget. I know it's not mentioned very often, but during one of the presidential elections, a high school friend of mine did a series of war games about nuclear weapons that was called The Day After. And these were apparently essentially to make people fearful of nuclear weapons and that we had to be careful. Uh, I don't know that it had much of an impact, but you can see how that would even be possible. There's no reason why a campaign couldn't conduct a series of simulations that examine future policies, as opposed to having one person say them and then everybody supposed to get in line.
Yeah, it sounds like this also it speaks to me as a former teacher, and obviously you too, since this is how you instinctively teach. But I think it's, even though it seems like an obvious question to us, like, why is it important that people should get to go their own way towards their conclusions instead of being told an answer, even if you think that's the answer they're going to arrive at?
Yeah. People don't want to be told. Adults want to learn. Adults want to understand. Uh, as purveyors of democracy, that fits right in, doesn't it?
I mean, I would say so. Yes. As a student, I would also really, I think, enjoyed your class. So it sounds like what you did as a teacher is very instinctive, right? You're looking for what is going to make your students respond and what's going to really teach them something. So a lot of teachers do listen to this podcast. So if you had advice for somebody who wants to go into their classroom and start doing a version of wargaming, um, how can they structure it so that if they're not just ready to ask a question, like they can get started with something really simple?
Should the United States provide military aid to Ukraine?
Just ask.
That's it.
So then what do you just have the students research it and come back and argue about it?
Yes. And then what that does two things. One of them is it helps them understand the complexity, and it also gets them interested in the subject.
Interesting. So I guess then another question I have for you is, you've had kind of a long teaching career. Um, am I correct in assuming that you taught both before and after the internet was readily available in classrooms?
Yes, yes, yes.
So the other thing that's kind of interesting when you say that, right, is, I feel like information is now available to us at lightning speed, but maybe in a less reliable way. Um, uh, you know, how do you how have you seen, I guess, the research that students do in response to these kinds of questions change in its speed and in its depth before and after the introduction of computer searches?
I don't know that I could say anything about how people's research has changed. I do know that it's easier to form a group to examine an issue in a gaming like way than it was when the internet didn't exist. I mean, that's more, uh, that path is easier, which is what I've been doing on Ukraine.
Yeah, have you been using Zoom?
No, no. I just did even more simple than that. For example, I sent out an email Friday in which I sort of outlined the issues. Uh, no Zoom.
Interesting. Okay, so not all of us have access to a classroom setting anymore where we have people who are going to push us. But I think that what you were asking your students to do is good for everybody to try to do in some kind of way. So, how do we take some of the lessons that you learned from wargaming and asking questions in your classes and apply them to our own discussions as we try to develop informed opinions and achieve consensus with other people?
I have to say, I hadn't really thought about extending it the way I think you're sort of implying, but I could see a sixth grade class doing a year's worth of wargaming. Where in fact you don't tell them wargaming because somebody's parent is going to object, but you're doing that andragogy, the adult learning methodology, in which you raise the major question that needs to be answered and having them investigate it and then discuss alternatives of what they've learned.
Interesting. All right. So then just a couple of like kind of chilled out questions for the end of the interview. One, so you're not a hobby gamer, so I won't ask you what games you've been playing, but I will ask, what have you been reading recently that you thought was really good and that you would recommend?
Oh, it's almost embarrassing. My day, it takes about 2 hours looking at the Ukrainian war things. I send out a blog every day on what's happening in Ukraine. And once I do that, my life gets pretty filled up.
So not too much reading.
No, I just, there's the rest of the day that has to be taken care of.
Fair enough. Although that actually is perfectly into the next question, which is if people want to follow your work and they want to get involved and they want to know what you're putting out there, how do they get in touch with you? It sounds like you've got a blog, so how do we get to it?
Just send me an email address and I'll add you to the blog.
And what's your email? Where should they send it?
Amgard at AOL.com. At
Sam
AOL,
Guard.
at AOL.com.
Gotcha. All right. Sam, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this. I feel like it's fun to talk to you as somebody who's really like been part of a lot of high level policy discussions, but also as a teacher.
My pleasure.
All right, everybody out there. So you heard Sam. If you want to follow his blog, send him your email and he'll add you. And I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. So find me literally anywhere. I'm terminally online. So please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.